Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to another edition of Blog Talk Radio, BFP. And tonight on the show we have Art Campbell, and he's going to be speaking about his research and his study that he's done with the San Augustin UFO crash. And on the lines, my co-host Nick just called in.
Yeah,
hi.
On the line, Nick? Yeah, I'm on.
And we're going to start off tonight's show. Art, could you explain a little bit about your background and what got you started with the UFO crash studies?
Well, it was actually back in the 50s. I'm in my late 70s now, and I was a young college student in the Kansas City area, and I was interested in UFOs after having been in the service for a while. I got out in '54, U.S. Navy, San Diego, USS Boxer, a couple of assignments, and so we formed a NICAP, that's National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena chapter in Kansas City about 1958, and I was the director of that, and we did a few investigations around the Kansas City area, but there really wasn't much came up. We did find a contactee, somebody who claimed to have been on a UFO and gone to visits and so forth, who came to the town to investigate, but there was very little activity in UFOs and so forth. So I kind of followed it for a while. I went into teaching for 30 years, and went to small towns. I was a principal, I was a football coach, and other assorted jobs around small high schools. And there's not very many people in small towns that you sit down and talk to UFOs about. Most of the people are in urban areas. So when I retired in 1989, I was able to get to a mall one day. They had a out-of-this-world sale. I didn't think much of the sale, but they had a display of UFO stuff from the Center for UFO Studies out of Chicago. So I got kind of reinterested looking at a display at the mall. And then stayed kind of interested until I was directed out to talk to a rancher at a site in New Mexico where the UFO was supposed to have come down. And that was the story we're going to talk about tonight.
So I think you kind of answered this just a second ago, but what exactly is the San Augustin crash?
Well, there was 30-foot disc, 25 or 30-foot disc, discovered by a civil engineer. We believe on the morning of July 2nd, 1947. Outside were a couple of bodies, and inside were a couple of bodies. The craft had been split open on one side. And this is well known in the UFO lore as a fellow named Barney Barnett. He describes this. And his story was first told 32 years later in a book by Burbidge and Moore, which I recommend, called The Roswell Incident. And his story was told in that book. And he described the bodies that he saw, little gray figures in kind of jumpsuits, large heads. But by the way, in those days they didn't have large eyes. He did say their eyes were oddly spaced. But they didn't have an opposing thumb and forefinger like we do. The thumb was further down on the palm, which he mentioned. He thought the ones that he saw were all males. He didn't see any evidence of females. And they were about 4.5 feet tall. And we were able to find what we were pretty sure was the site by the fact that the sagebrush hadn't grown back. And we did a lot of work to find out why. And it was not radioactive. We found out there was no radioactivity in the area. So it had been grubbed out, apparently. The roots and everything had been grubbed out for about 135 feet, about 28 feet wide. And that led us right to where the thing ended up, we believe.
So one thing that I'd like to get started with was, how does this relate to Roswell? Because I know Roswell happened around the same exact time, like a couple of days apart.
Exact time, yes. know that it does relate to Roswell. We call it the Roswell timeline. And I have one in front of a book. By the way, I do have a website, and I'm looking at it right now. Can I mention it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's UFOcrashbook.com. And we were talking about well, you had to repeat your question again.
Oh, I was saying, how is it similar to Roswell?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, it was the same week because we think possibly two craft collided. Well, that's the theory that Stan Friedman postulated sometime back, and it's as good as any. But we have no evidence of this, that they are connected. However, they did find a craft over there several days later. This may be part of the Roswell crash, but this one came down near a highway. The one over at the Foster Ranch was in a very, very remote area. So it's possible that two craft collided. That's as close as we could get it to connecting it to Roswell.
So there's a theory that the San Augustin crash may have collided with the Roswell crash?
That's one possible theory, yes. There are other theories that we had a powerful Doppler radar going at the time that managed to balance the guidance system of a couple of UFOs. And by the way, the Roswell UFO crash was sort of a delta wedge-shaped craft. It was not round like a lot of you see. And the one over on the San Augustin plains, the surveyor, civil engineer that discovered it, it was a round craft about 25 or 30 feet in diameter. So it's possible there were two different UFO in the air, and it could be two different groups of UFO people flying over. But we think perhaps the nuclear activity had really brought them here in 1945, and when we set off our first A-bomb, and then started doing a lot of testing after the war. But we think that that had something to do with them showing up in the skies.
Well, Nick, did you have a question, Nick?
No, not at this point.
Oh, all right. Well, I was going to get started with some of the evidence. What did the government say happened? Like, what was their explanation?
The government has never acknowledged Roswell yet, let alone this one. This one was fairly easy to cover up because you had some very remote people, and you had government people, employees, discover it. The surveyor was working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who discovered the site, and he was over the years and concerned about his job. And he was more or less certain at the site that he had best not say anything in the interest of national security, and in the interest of him keeping his job, I think he agreed. So he didn't tell anyone but a few friends in the 20 years he lived after that. He actually lived until 1969, 22 years. And he told 7 or 8 people we know of, and we've interviewed about 6 of them. And some of them have passed away by now, but no, the government has never acknowledged that there's anything over there at all. And as a matter of fact, our project is still pretty much under the radar. We're trying to get a book published, and some of your people can see that what we're trying to do there on that website, UFOcrashbook.com. So we're starting to get more interest from people back east. We were on the radio show in New York last night out of New Jersey. So people are starting to learn about this once we started getting the material synthesized and put into book form.
Well, so when San Augustin crashed, did it crash in like a remote area, or did it crash on someone's land? Or?
Yes, well, actually it crashed on state land. But the San Augustin plains are an old Ice Age melt lake from the Pleistocene area, like 11,000, 14,000 years ago. And the water evaporated, and as it did, it brought wildlife in because we had grassy shores and so forth. And then that brought in the Indians and Native Americans, sorry. And there's lots of Native American remains around the lake. So it was famous for finding Native American artifacts and so forth. And but it came down 9/10 of a mile from Highway 12, which runs on the west side of the plains. Mm-hmm. And our surveyor said that he was driving along the plains in the morning. I would think he was on his way to a courthouse to check some land records, about 20 miles south of there. And he saw something glinting in the sagebrush. Well, he'd been working with the farmers for a couple of years there, and after a while you get to know who's building a building and who isn't. And so it wasn't an aluminum roof, but it took him about 15 minutes to get over there. He had to go around to where there was a gate, of course, and down cross country for about a quarter of a mile or so, and he was able to drive right down to the little ridge where it was impacted against. And when he got out, he thought perhaps it might be part of the atomic energy, might be a nuclear bomb or something that hadn't gone off, which would be an interesting experience. And when he got closer, he see the bodies. He knew it wasn't of this earth, is what he told friends.
How many bodies did they find exactly?
We hear 3 or 4. We think 3 were on the ground, and 1 was in the craft.
Were they all dead when they found them, or were they alive?
Yes, they were dead. They were all dead. And it wasn't our atmosphere apparently hadn't anything to do with it. Apparently the crash had malfunctioned and split open when it hit the ground. That's my guess. And it came in for a flat dead stick landing with no power and had too much momentum, because we knew it slid along the ground for at least 200 feet before it to impact against a little ridge. And so, yeah, it was. It had a split on the side, and but it wasn't like one of our airplanes splitting on the side. There were no wires showing it, and apparently it was an integrated machine, kind of like flying an integrated circuit. And they think that the pilots in their little suits were part of the mechanism of the plane. They controlled where it went and so forth by the energy went through the bodies. We're not real sure of this. This is just all speculation.
So do you have any documents or anything that point to where they took the bodies?
Well, we think that we know that we have a witness who saw a set of 2 witnesses who saw 2 sets of bodies going to the same place. So we assume that one set may have been Roswell bodies. There's also 3 or 4 of them. And another set of bodies were sent by truck to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And another set, a second set, were flown there by a guy who was a pilot who's come forward. His nickname was Captain Henderson. He was the pilot that took, they think, the Roswell bodies to Wright-Patterson. I think they had some places there where they could be stored without a lot of building the new facilities and so forth. And essentially we're looking here at cold storage until they could do something better. But another one that was going through Fort Riley, Kansas, in a convoy. They put the crates in a warehouse overnight, and one of the guys that peeked in the crate later became a lieutenant colonel, and he said he looked like gray children in purple fluid, and apparently the purple fluid was a preservative of some kind to keep the body from disintegrating. But you know, they're between New Mexico and in Ohio. You got at least 4 nights maybe. And so we think there were 2 sets of bodies went back to Wright-Patterson, Ohio. And so they may have been on view shortly at Kirkland Air Force Base in northern New Mexico, and possibly down at near the Holloman Air Force Base in southern New Mexico, at a place called Alamogordo. They were doing lots of work there with missiles, and ground air missiles, surface air missiles, and was doing a lot of secret testing there of various things. And we think that at least briefly the bodies were there before they were shipped out.
So were the bodies similar to the ones at Roswell? Like were they like completely different, or were they similar?
Well, oddly enough, the Barnett, our engineer, had described the bodies to several people that 20 years before he died, and they matched exactly the description of the Roswell bodies. And there's some contention here that it may have been the same crash, but we suspect that they were just different people. People looked like a different craft, because the 2 crafts were apparently very different. So but you see, his description wasn't published till 32 years after 1947, about 1980. So it was 1980 before we had a general knowledge of what the bodies looked like. But nowadays they talk about the alien bodies having huge, big black eyes. That wasn't the case in these bodies that were found over by Roswell and over on the plains.
Well, a question that was coming in right now was, have you ever looked in Project Blue Book or anything like that and found any kind of information on this case?
Not the one I'm working on. I believe the Blue Book was closed before the Roswell, the first Roswell book in 1980. I think Blue Book was closed in the early 70s, maybe in the late 60s. And so they had lots of sightings in Project Blue Book, but we didn't get the really good sighting. It just had some curious sightings, and it was kind of a PR thing for the Air Force. It was not a bona fide collection place for UFO sightings. But some of the civilian groups in those days had some spectacular stuff. Aerial phenomenal research out of Phoenix was collecting material. The group I'd worked for was the National Investigating Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and that was, they were collecting material. So you had some civilian groups that were collecting UFO material, and it's far more available and far more information from civilian groups than the military in those days.
So speaking of foil, I know that your website says that they found some of the weird foil that's commonly described in UFO crashes, that you found some material that you think is the foil.
Yeah, I'm looking at the website now, the UFOcrashbook.com, and I have a chapter there dealing with foil, and I'm going to swing down to that. It's the mental analysis of the wafer would be that be the chapter 8 on my website, and we see the photographs there at UFOcrashbook.com, and then there's some red numbers that talk about the chapters in the book, and we show a picture of the foil there, and it's really, really thin foil and much thinner than your household foil. And it was buried, and then as the winds blew and the rain came down, the geological formation that the arroyo was in was called an alluvial fan, which means particles of mountains and hillsides and so forth slide down into a valley, that slide down into a flat area that spreads out. Essentially, that is an alluvial fan. And so about most 9/10 of the way down is where the crash occurred, to the sagebrush, and that foil which is pictured there in Chapter 8, I believe, is stuff that we have. We're going to be doing some analysis on it. We finally found someone who would do a isotope ratio analysis for us, and it's going to cost $5,000-$6,000 just to run one test. So we feel very fortunate. But this foil that we found matches no known foil in the world. And we can tell that by all foils that are products, all the ingredients, the ratios are patented. And it goes through the Aluminum Association, and they have a list of all foils that have been made on this planet since 1932. And they've had their association going since about 1950. And our foil is too thin and has too much silicon, which is a very hard substance to make a good commercial foil.
Well, I have a question right now in our chat room. People are asking us, have you seen it in person?
Have I seen what?
Oh, people right now are asking in the chat room, do you own it? Have you seen it in person?
I'm not having a little trouble with the little breakup of the word here, so I need to get the last word again. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, they were saying, do you own the material? Have you seen it in person?
Yes, I do. I do own it, and it's in a very safe place. If anybody wants to know that either. I have not been contacted with the government, but I'm ready. My lawyer says that all I have to do if somebody comes to the door and says, "Can we speak to you?" is to hand them his card and say, I'm being represented by this gentleman, by this lawyer. And they legally can't speak to you until they go through the process of contacting a lawyer. So I don't have to answer any questions, if I can. So I'm ready. One day I did. Was sitting by the window working on the computer, and I saw two guys walking on the sidewalk. And one had a black briefcase, and two guys in shirt sleeves, and outside it looked like a black car had pulled up. I thought, oh boy, here they are. So I went to the front door and was ready to hand them the card that the lawyer said to give them, and it turned out to be one of the missionaries. And I was very glad to see him. I invited him in and said, I don't know what you're drinking, boys, but I'm serving I'm pouring, whatever you're having. So we had some ice water and lemonade, if I call it. Had a nice discussion on the Book of Mormon, but nothing about UFOs.
So, have you, besides that one incident, have you ever had anybody try to take it from you, or anybody say anything to you, like government?
No, at first I went to conferences, and I didn't take the stuff with me. And then everybody said, oh, yeah, sure, I got a piece of UFO in my pocket here, and Brother John had one upside. He puts on his pillow every night. And, I don't know whether he's expecting the tooth fairy to come take it or what, but it turns out that everybody had something. So I had to really start taking my stuff to conferences before people would be looking at it. Now, we have that artifact that we have in the chapter, it's called it's chapter 6 and 4. The chapter in the book is that ain't no fart, no cow, and that's what two cattle inspectors told me at a restaurant. And that's exactly the way I found it there in chapter 4. And I laid it on a rock and photographed it with my blue bandana. And that's 5 minutes after I found it. And you see the darker areas around the bottom, that was under the sand. And the topper areas had been scoured out, and it was laying on top of the surface underneath a piece of sagebrush. And it looked like a solidified piece of chicken fat. And it was about the size of a fist, and it had been collapsed. And we found out, after many trials and errors, what it was made of. It was made of a common material called polyethylene, high-density polyethylene. But it has one feature. It was amorphous, meaning that It didn't have a crystalline structure. It couldn't have been hard. So it would have been kind of soft like a hot water bottle or an ice an ice bag goes on your head, that kind of thing. And it had chambers, and we think it might be some kind of an artificial organ from one of the aliens, but it doesn't match anything known on Earth. But anyway, we've been able to locate.
So now is it
and
like hard, like a rock now, or is it still like spongy or squishy?
No, it's been solidified in the sand for 50 years. We found it in '96, which was the 49th year of the crash. So it had been out there since 49 years at least, and the polyethylene had gotten a chance to cross-link and was chipped around the edges, and we were able to look inside to see what was in there and pulled out the stuff. I'm going to go what's called a Chapter 6, which is talks about the analysis, the artifact examination and its contents. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't find very much in the thing, and polyethylene is Tupperware, and it's just hard to get excited about Tupperware. And but the fact that you have soft Tupperware would be unusual. Anyhow, we got to examining a small piece of starch that was the size of a pinhead. Now, on that starch, we found a gold wire, which you can see there if your listeners have their computers on. There's a gold wire there, and we're in Chapter 6. And that red thing behind it is a human hair. That's about 70 microns thick. The gold wire is about 10 microns. Now, we have things that small now in microtechnology, nanotechnology, mm-hmm. but we didn't have it in 47.
So one thing I would like to ask about the foil, since we're on the subject of that and the organ, how much of the foil did you actually find?
Oh, I would say it's been it was laying flat at one time. It's sort of like half shingles. So we've never had a piece of flattened out and measured it. It was not part of our plan. But I imagine we have a couple of square feet of it. I say we because another gentleman in New Mexico named Chuck Wade, and he has done extensive work on the foil. And we're about ready to have a breakthrough on it this year when we get the isotope analysis done. And that copper wire also we found on that pinhead. We're talking here a pinhead of starch, kind of like tapioca.
Yeah.
And on that, what you're seeing is this stuff that we've had blown up in a scanning electron microscope. So we were able to get that material out there and find out it was starch. And this was on it, and we have a whole chapter on this in our book called "The UFO Crash at San Augustin" on the analysis of this material.
Well, another question that's coming up right now is, does the foil hold any of the properties like you hear on the TV shows and in the books where it like undends itself and things like that?
Well, we had. We were featured on the UFO Hunter show in 2008, and it aired, I think, December 2nd, 2008. And they took this artifact that you saw there, and we said it looks like Tupperware, to a lab in Los Angeles, and they couldn't identify it, nor did they find anything more inside. And we have yet to open it. If we did, we better do it in some very scientific conditions because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff inside there, including more gold wire, probably. But people don't get excited about aluminum foil. It's part of their life. And I can say, well, the aluminum foil you buy has only 1% silicon and 0.5% iron, and all these things are little formulations. But the closer they can get it to pure aluminum, the better it is. And so all the Reynolds wrap and Alcoa and so forth have much smaller amounts of the things that we have in our foil. So I would suspect that this foil was some kind of, could have been a barrier or something to keep something from getting close to something else, because foil is known for its good barrier qualities. And it's not a good conductor. So I think probably copper or gold or something like that might be better. But so we don't think it was part of anything electronic. And it could have been that the foil was put on kind of like shingles under the outside of the UFO, the outside cover. This is not an outside cover. Foil is not an outside cover. But we suspected something underneath dealing with the shielding qualities of the propulsion system of some kind. But we have no way of knowing that.
Well, one thing that I was personally wondering was, how come there was such a bad government cleanup? Like, if there's all these artifacts, how come they did such a bad job, or like they didn't do it as good as they would at Roswell, for instance?
Well, they didn't do a bad job of cleanup. They did a great job of cleanup. But what brought the archaeologists, there were a set of archaeologists came to this site after the UFO crash, and they wouldn't talk about it. But what brought the archaeologists to the plain of San Augustin, I told you earlier, we had a receding lake. We had lots of wildlife. When you have lots of wildlife, you're going to have Native Americans, making camp nearby. This is the way it goes. And so they apparently scoured the area. Now, we're not talking hard ground here. I'm trying to liken this to you know how a sandbox, some of you folks who live in the areas where you have a sandbox in the winter, gets kind of compacted, and until the kids start playing in it in the summer, it gets kind of loose and fluffy. Well, half of the soil where this thing was, this arroyo, was sand. The other half was less soil, which is very fine grains of soil. So when this thing hit and came into this area with this sand, it'd be a huge dust cloud coming up. And so you could get down there and clean up everything in the world that you could see. You could rake it, whatever you wanted to, and you get all the stuff out of there. And yet, what brought the archaeologists to this area is the fact that you had a lot of erosion on the surface. And there are archaeologists who literally found projectile points, spear points. We're not talking bow and arrow. This is 1,500 years before the bow and arrow, the spear point. Artifacts, projectile points on the surface that had been exposed by the wind and rain that you have down there in the wintertime. This is how our material came back to the surface. It was under the surface, and the surface shrank when we had erosion coming through the area, and our stuff ended up on top of the ground. So the government did a pretty good cleanup, and so when the ship had to have crashed, some sort of the material would have had to have been buried in the soil or something, is what you were saying, and it came up with erosion? Actually, we're looking here at a long stretch of 150 feet max. And it could be in any of this area, because the arroyo, the alluvial fan coming down with soft material, dirt, sagebrush, and it took out all the sagebrush. That's why we didn't find any in this gap area. And so when it eroded over the years, it would come up. I worked at the site, I think about 1998 or 9. I was out there by myself. And I had a hard rain that I already got in my truck, which wasn't far away. And I came back and I found foil sticking out of the sand that had been uncovered by the rain. So
do you think
if I could find it,
possibly be more?
Yeah, well, I think there is more, but we pretty well got the easy stuff. We had to dig for most of the stuff we followed that one chapter where we had all that foil in that one take, but the easy stuff we pretty well gotten. But it could be a quarter of an inch under the sand you never know was there. Now, so I said, well, I get a metal detector. Well, sure. But there was also a lot of tin cans on top of the sand and the dirt. And he said, well, they must have washed in there. Well, they couldn't have because it's uphill. So we think when they filled in the trench, that this thing obviously made at least a 3 or 4 foot trench. They went up the arroyo, picked up some sand, and dumped it in the trench to smooth it all over. A typical military operation, to smooth it over, it's going to look great, right? Well, that's fine until it rains and the wind blows, and then what you have right underneath the surface is going to be exposed. So we have a suspicion that someone stayed out there at that site and came back every year. We found campsite remains of bottles and things that could not have come down in any other way. There is trash that comes down the arroyo from a nearby community, but that's how they get rid of their trash over there, at least in the early days. And we think that some of this was buried, and they brought it down with a front loader, some kind of a front loader machine, and dumped it in the trench. Well, that would essentially turn it upside down, and it still probably wouldn't cover up the stuff that was in the edges of the trench. And I think that's what eroded was the stuff that was just under the surface. And then the site wasn't brand new. It was known about when we first went out there. But some of the other UFO researchers got to arguing about who was there first and who wasn't there, and who did this, who did that, and they got to fighting each other. They never dug a shovel full of sand, and that's amazing to me that they would go to all the trouble to argue and try to prove each other wrong and not even look at the site. So I started digging out there, and when I got there in '95. And started finding stuff that same year I started digging. And the artifact that we saw with blue bandana in that first chapter, the main part of Cardinal Cal, we're dealing here with the website. And so your people who just tuned in to UFOcrashbook.com, and we have 15 chapters there. And the artifact that we found, that was the first thing we found on top of of the soil under a piece of sagebrush. And that really got us a little interested in the site, because there's nothing like that. We found nothing at all like that. And I've been a Western historian for about 30 years. I could go out to a site, and the china and the tin cans, occasionally a license plate with a date, which are very rare. You can kind of figure when the people were there. And how long they were there. Because even tin cans have a history. Some of the early cans didn't have a lip on them. You couldn't use today's can opener on an early can. And so they would people that were looking for canned foods and sheep herders and somebody would just take a big knife and cut it 2 ways and split open the can and get stuff out of it. Or if they wanted milk for their coffee and tea, they would punch a little hole in each side. Most of you have seen that. They didn't have electricity out there until 1945, so they were using a lot of canned goods.
Well, I have a quick question. I would just like to know, how did you locate the crash site?
Well, I had a rancher that I called him from Roswell, and I had a chance of going to the well-known Roswell site. And staying in Roswell for another day, and the wife and I were coming back from a trip back east. And I said, let's call this guy over there and see what. So it was daylight savings day, I think it was April 20, 94. And he said, well, we're going to work Canada tomorrow. If we get out here before we leave at 8:30, we'll show you how to get down to the site. He didn't say take me there. He didn't just tell us how to get down there. Well, we got out there in time for a little breakfast and a cup of coffee and so forth. He drew a map of where this was. He said, now, we don't know anything about UFO crash, but there's a bunch of sagebrush missing out there, and it's quite possible something came in there and took it out. And he said that maybe the UFO came and skipped down here and then went later on. Well, later on, we flew over the site and found no evidence of a skip mark and either way for 5 miles. So we're pretty sure it came in there and stayed there. But anyhow, It took us about 15, 20 minutes to find it. It was about 10 miles south of his house. And he's one of the ranchers that leases the land there. Most of your land on the plains of San Augustin is leased, often owned by somebody out of town. People don't live on the land. Now, the rancher did, but he had 120,000 acres, but he leased about 70,000 of those acres from the state, Uncle Sam, or private individuals. And that's how they get the land for cattle. They lease it. But it goes, when the property sells, the lease goes with it. So when you're buying somebody's property, you're also buying all these leases.
Well, one of my other team members on the phone actually has a question for you.
Sure.
Oh, hi. How you doing? Sorry, I just got on the phone. But what I was wondering is, maybe this question was already answered because I just got on the phone. But how long have you really been interested in the UFO studies?
Well, since about 1952, when we didn't have hardly any information, and we were still 30 years from the Roswell disclosure that didn't come out until 1980. So I started 28 years before most people even knew about UFOs from the Roswell thing. So I'd gotten interested in some clubs and groups. There were publications in those days. You could read about them, but it was pretty far out stuff. Nothing isn't now. But that's how long I've been interested in it, and it kind of draws you in when you find something no one else has seen. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and I got another question too. I was reading on your website briefly. I seen there were pictures of like a shoe sole or something. There's like a picture of like a sole.
Repeat the question, will you?
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I was on your website briefly, and I seen there was a picture of a sole of a shoe. And
that's
one of my team members.
Yeah, we found shoe soles there. Now that'll be the test 13 in our book. We found 2 shoe soles, and I'm going to click on it now. And the one is actually the size of that 25-cent piece, and it's 4 7/8 inches long. And at the widest, right near the 25-cent piece, the pictures in the book that you can get a copy of. We also have a CD of the book too. But the widest part of that shoe is 1 1/8 inches, and it's 4 7/8 inches long. Now we had analysis done of all the materials. There were 9 layers in the shoe. 3 in the sole and some cloth, and we think it might have looked like this little sketch there, kind of like a little booty or a slipper.
Oh, yeah.
But we found that the layers were not uncommon materials. We found unusual uses of materials, but not materials we had never seen before. And that was interesting. Maybe we've discovered everything it could be discovered. But we haven't used them all the same way. So it would be, we found that shoe sole had about 5 or 6 layers of cotton, regular cotton, with an undisclosed coating on it. And I took the shoe up to Nike, and they wouldn't even let me in the door with it. So I finally had to make arrangements to meet some guy at coffee, and he said he'd stuck it into the lab and took a look at it. He said, well, we couldn't afford to make this shoe and sell it because it wouldn't. Our kids who have 4 7/8 inch feet are going to be 4 5 inches in 3 months, so they'd be outgrowing it. And he says another thing is, if you have a shoe 4 7/8 inches long, you're going to have a foot that's at least 2 3/4 inches wide. Ours is half that size. So he said, this is made for a small adult foot. And I wanted to tell him the worst way, where it came from, but I thought better of it. And then we found one that's about the same length, but it's broken off in half. And it's shown in the picture above there, chapter 13, the shoe soles. And it had we projected it out. It had an adolescent foot would fit that, but it would have to be extremely narrow. So we suspect it might have some implications too. But does that mean you have two different sized aliens? Because the one that we, our engineer only saw them all the same size. So that's the mystery, isn't it? So,
yeah.
But that belongs to a long foot. And I had some few people look at it originally as I sent them pictures. 30 different companies I sent some pictures of the shoe stuff to and measurements and so forth. And the most interesting comment I got back was a guy at a shoe store down in Socorro, New Mexico, said that wouldn't fit any foot that ever walked in here. And one guy thought it reminded him of something that called aspergits that the Peruvian and Bolivian Indians wore. And they had no idea where this shoe could come from. And then having 9 layers would mean that it was you couldn't afford to make it. You take a look at your child's shoe tonight, some of you folks, and you're going to see one piece of polyethylene and one inner sole, and that's it. You know, the layers. So this was much more sophisticated. And of all things, they said, well, what color might it have been? Gray? No, it was red. We found some red material back underneath the sole, which was also kind of wrapped around some material that was kind of pink. And we think that the bottom, that this shoe had been red at one time.
So what do you think they came from? Do you think they could have fallen off maybe when the ship crashed or something?
Well, it's a good question. I have a chapter in a little story in the back of the book called The Green's Gap Gray. And essentially a rancher is driving down about that time. You never get the exact time. You know, people are keeping dates and calendars in a pickup truck, you know. But about that time, it was somewhere in 47 or 8, the story goes, it came out of, by the way, a national a security, some Air Force intelligence people were working on this problem, and we're trying to keep in mind to answer questions and so forth, and we're doing a lot of work around it. And I think this story came up at one of their meetings. But in any case, a rancher is driving a 1939 or 38 Ford pickup truck down Highway 12 again, which is exactly near where this thing crashed, and sees what looks like a child walking parallel to his direction in a pasture. Now, to get to the pasture, you have to have a fence, because that's what keeps the cows in. So he went down to a few hundred feet to a gate, and stopped on the other side of the road. And apparently the child saw him and stopped, and then just kept walking. And he seemed kind of dazed. So he could see it was not any. So he was still thinking child, and he went to the gate and to the being, let's call it, in a little gray suit, which is what our surveyor described when he saw them. They had little gray suits, a stretchy fabric. By the way, we didn't have stretchy fabrics till ski equipment came out in the mid-50s, by the way. Mm-hmm. So we didn't have stretchy fabric in 47. And anyhow, he coaxed, drugged, carried this little dazed figure to his pickup truck, and had no other. Now, what's plan 2? Well, he thinks we're going to take him home to his wife, so he lives at a little place called Green's Gap, about 5 miles north of a town called Horse Springs. Mm-hmm. And he takes the car up there, and they try to give it water and food, and it won't eat. It just sits there and kind of stares and looks around at the dog barking and things like that. It's not excited. It's just dazed. And so they said, well, we better get a hold of the sheriff. This kid doesn't belong to anybody we know. And, of course, we're looking here at the opposed four fingers and with no opposed thumb, was lower on the palm. And gray material that the ranch wife has never seen. And no ears to speak of, hardly any nose. It doesn't speak or grumble or make any noises. So it's really time to plan B to call a sheriff. The sheriff's about 30 miles south of there, in a town called Reserve. And they called the sheriff, and by the way, they didn't have radios in the car in those days, so they said, come on up here first thing in the morning, Sheriff, we got a strange child here. And he said, well, we haven't had any children reported as missing. He said, well, you better get up here and see this thing, because we don't know whether it's missing or not, but we should deal with it. So he got in the car early and came up, but no radio. And the couple got up, and they had left the child, so to speak, sitting in the chair in the kitchen, and it was gone. I never saw it again. About 20 minutes later, the sheriff pulls up and said, where's the child? And he said, well, we're not sure where. They looked at the barn, they all couldn't find a thing. Never found tracks or anything. So it's possible that was one that lived, but he was so dazed, being on another planet and being around vehicles that he didn't know anything about, and people was twice his size, at least a third again as big. It would have been a terrifying experience to even an alien. So yeah. So that's kind of that's who might have worn that shoe, but we've never had a chance to find out because he disappeared. So we never knew what happened to him.
I mean, that's very interesting.
Give me the question there.
Oh, yeah, one of my team members actually had a question.
Okay, shoot.
Nick?
Yeah?
Oh, didn't you? You just wrote me, you said you had a question about the case of the child?
Oh, yeah, when did all of this happen? You just explained.
We think it was, they said late 40s. And,
okay.
And that would be in our timeline. It didn't surface till 50 years later, when the rancher, whose children he's an older rancher, so his children had gone, but they had told the story at family reunions and so forth, and they called the thing the day Dad found the little one. It's kind of a family story that they told, and so they think it. They tried to pinpoint it. We can't say it was July 2nd, 1947, but we can say it was after the war, it was the late 40s, which would be 47 in July would be about be considered late 40s. And so, but these things pop up, and there's hardly any way you can evaluate them. So we just kind of put it down, but we don't have many stories like that. There's a gal, if anybody's on the website, there's a gal on the home page, and go to the home page, and this gal pointing at a UFO, and those are the famous, very large array radio telescopes in the picture. Now, this is not a real picture. It's a photo reenactment. And she had gone into Socorro. She's a ranch wife. I got to know pretty well. She's a government employee. She worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture at about 10 miles west of where you see this happen. But this UFO, which she said was about 100 feet in diameter, followed her down a highway from between Socorro and a little town called Daniel, and up through Magdalena, which was another little town. And she first saw it after she looked in the rearview mirror coming out of Magdalena. She thought it was an airplane ready to crash. Well, when you're driving, you just can't keep something in the rearview mirror. You're going to make a turn, or you're going to slow down or go down a hill or uphill. So she kept looking at it whenever she could, and it stayed behind her about 400 or 500 feet. Now, there were other cars on the road, but not many. There's cars up there. There's not very many. Every 5 miles you might meet a car in those days. And so they had put this radio telescope thing in 1979, and each one of those big radio telescopes is 85 tons and 135 feet across. And she said that her the UFO was about 100 feet across. Well, I said, well, how would you judge 100 feet? She said, well, I'm here, ranch-wise, their distances. She says, we have to know how far off a range squirrel is to get the kids in and to wash off the line. She said, when we put fence posts in, they're 12 feet apart. Only when we have a gauge, it's going to be 14 to 15 to accommodate a trailer. And she said, our pavement out here is 22 feet. It was only 20 feet till about 5 years ago. They added 2 feet. That's all she knew. And the UFO was 5 times bigger than the size of when it came over the road at one time. She said it was four times bigger than the width of the pavement, which would make it about 100 feet. So she pulls over and gets out, and the kids are seeing it and watching it out the back window. And I talked to the kids, who were adults by the time I got to them, and they were just really excited. But then she stopped, and it stopped. Then it kind of crept up right over the very large array, and here we have instruments pointing out to outer space, shooting out things millions of miles away, looking for radio signals for beings from other planets, sending radio signals. And she says, they've got a very fancy air-conditioned room there, but she went into a visitor center near there, and she says, they put in a few windows and might see something. So that was her story, and so the very large array is still out there. It's being run by SETI now, and occasionally you'll see it on TV. And this is her story, and she was one of the people that lived in the area that had this sighting in 1982, right over the only one we know was over a radio telescope, and that would be about 40 miles west of Socorro, Interstate 25 in New Mexico, and according to San Augustin. And where we're working is 15 miles south of where she's pointing at that UFO. And that's all in the book. And this is her story is in the back of the book, right next to the Greens Gap Gray. So we're not we don't think we're putting fantasy in here and things that aren't true. But, you got to take these things with a grain of salt. When a friend of yours, though, tells you she saw something, he's got to, give the person a lot of credit. They're not going to be lying to you if you know them well.
Well, I have a couple of questions relating to witnesses. Just curious, how many witnesses have you found so far interviewed on the San Augustin crash?
No witnesses were alive, but we have people who talked to the gentleman who found it. There are about 12 that I knew of, and that we think he told. We were able to get signed statements from 2. The one lady who was a niece of his wife, and another gentleman who was a military friend. We pop up there to, you get to see if any of you guys have computers, and we're still on UFOcrackbook.com, and we'll go down to the Barney's work at Chapter 10, Travels and Discovery. And we see there, Chapter 10, that he was the surveyor, and this guy who's in the picture there that we're showing, was an Army man that came by and said, "We heard if I've seen a flying saucer, is it real?" She said, "Yes, it's real." So, and that's part of his story. And he was a surveyor and spent a lot of time out in the open. And then we had a colleague archaeologist came over. And this is interesting. You asked how many people were witnesses. Well, the archaeologists, we were not on the plane to San Augustin in July 1947. We found where they had made camp July 1, 10 miles away. Now, the question is, why why did they lie to us? We don't know. In Chapter 9, we
Oh, you go ahead.
It's possible they came up on the site, and the guy didn't want to get his PhD, And he wouldn't have gotten it if he'd said he went on to a crashed UFO with San Augustin. In the chapter 9 of the book, we have a picture of him in World War I, 1918. And there's another photograph is there with his wife in 1948. So it's a 30 year difference there, 40.
So how many witnesses do you think are out there that you haven't found?
Well, the witnesses we're looking for, the archaeologists were dubious. They said they weren't there, and they all died before 92. So we can't really check that out unless somebody has, memoirs somewhere. And the other, what is Barney Barnett? There's a 5-year-old boy that said he came out rock hunting with his uncle and father and ran upon the crash. He's alive. And by the way, he said in an interview that the place looked like an explosion in an aluminum factory. And we found all that aluminum we showed you earlier, talked about earlier. So he had to have been there. You just don't say, we found aluminum and somewhere in the middle of the desert. And he had to have been there, or at least told somebody he was. So he's one witness, but he's been discredited because he said too much, and he remembered too much for a 5-year-old child. Let's put it that way. And so his recollections were not taken seriously. However, I think maybe we better go back and take another look at it, because he wouldn't have known, any way of knowing, that when he was out there with a bunch of people in 1990, they came in with a helicopter, by the way, that he was standing on top of all that foil. And we think when the helicopter left, we're about out of time, aren't we? That they turned up the ground and exposed some of the material that was there. We found it 2 years later.
Well, I have a weird situation. I know it's a little bit on topic, a little bit off topic. With the case that we're working on right now, we are starting to run out of witnesses, but because it happened in 1952, the witnesses are very hard to find. I was just curious. What did you do in a situation like that where you ran out of witnesses and you ran out of leads and you had to try to look for new ones, but you weren't sure where they were at?
Well, we have to find out. All we do now is second generation investigation. That would be talk to people who knew the person, and did he say anything? Now, if it was a very dramatic sighting of Sasquatch or whatever, he's got to repeat it unless he's been threatened not to, and take it seriously. So you always have to deal with the second-hand witness. But one of the things you would need is an affidavit that so-and-so told me that he saw such and such at such and such a date, because dealing with second-hand witnesses that won't put it in writing, you end up with absolutely nothing. Just because it's written in somebody's blog doesn't make it true, and including me. So we found all the people we knew who could have talked to this gentleman. We found his niece. We found his boss, who was still alive until '96. He told him